Please welcome Dr. Magnuson.
You're doing so well.
It's all you.
Thank you very much, and thanks the EarthFest Expo people, the organizers who put this on and invited me to come out here and talk about my work. And yes, I'm an economist, and so I really need to start off with a story about that. The story is it's a conversation between three people: a priest, an architect, and an economist. And so these people were debating among themselves as to whose discipline or whose profession is the oldest. And so the priest started off and he said, well, clearly my profession is the oldest. My subject matter is God. God created the entire universe out of chaos. So, obviously it's the oldest. And the architect said, well, now wait a minute. You said God created the universe out of chaos. Now to me, that's creating a structure. Therefore, that's architecture. My profession is the oldest. So the economist said, yeah. But who created all that chaos in the first place? We did that. So on that note, what I want to talk about first is COVID, and particularly our government's response to the pandemic and some of the aftermath, the economic aftermath of that. One of the things that COVID did for us is it gave us a snapshot of what happens when there are global disruptions in the supply chain, the economic supply chain. And I think we're all aware of all the things, suddenly things started to disappear, prices started to rise. It was real trouble. Now, speaking strictly in macroeconomic terms, supply side shocks are very, very troubling for two reasons. One, they throw the sand in the gears of the economic machine, and it causes it to kind of slow down, and things start to grind down. But also it causes prices to skyrocket. So it's kind of like a double whammy on the economy, and our policymakers and leaders started to panic about this. So the response was to pass some legislation, and the big one was the American Rescue Plan, or the American Rescue Plan $2 trillion program to bail out the economy, so to speak. Now, what they did was tantamount to take $2 trillion of what we call helicopter money and spread it around the country. And what I mean by helicopter money is something similar to flying helicopters over Rochester and throwing money out. And the reason they were doing that is because they wanted to get money in the hands of people so they could spend money, and the spending would keep the gears turning. And so, when we do something, when our government does something like that, they plunge themselves into deep deficit territory. So what I'm showing you here is the federal government budget deficit surplus chart over time. And if you look over there toward the right, you can see that big, deep spike. And what that is showing you is basically a $2 trillion deficit that the federal government plunged into when it started this American Rescue Plan. So the question is, how does the government finance something like this? And the answer is, well, they put it on the credit card, right? They borrow, or more specifically, they sell bonds. Now, the only institution, probably the only institution on the planet that has the resources to buy that much government debt is our central bank, the Federal Reserve. So over here, simultaneously with that big deficit spike you saw where the government suddenly went $2 trillion into debt, what you're also seeing over here are two things. This one, the M1, is an increase in the money supply. And this one here is the amount of assets that are held by the Federal Reserve. So what happened is the American Rescue Plan, they went $2 trillion further into debt. They needed to sell the debt, so they sold it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then bought it. Here you can see a sudden spike or increase in the Federal Reserve's holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. But over there is a sudden increase in the money supply. The story that I'm telling is that the Federal Reserve, in order to buy all of those U.S. Treasury bonds, they created money out of thin air. That's what they do. We call this monetizing the debt, where basically the government prints up money, metaphorically printing up money, in order to pay its debts. Now, intuitively, that might seem like a bad idea. So under most circumstances, this is a very bad idea because when the government starts printing up money to pay off its debts, very quickly the value of the currency starts to collapse, and you see hyperinflation, skyrocketing price inflation, currencies become unstable, etc. And we've seen this. We saw this happen in Latin American countries in the 1980s. It happened in this country actually in the 19th century, and maybe the most outstanding example was Germany in the interwar period between World Wars I and II, where the Deutschmark completely collapsed its value. And the reason that it did is because they printed up money to pay the debts. And a lot of times what happens is when you do this, the currency collapses and then the entire economy then turns to shambles. So needless to say, this is a very dangerous thing to do. And it's not something that the government will do very often. It can't do it very often without destroying the economy. So it gives you an idea of the kind of desperation or the desperate measures that the government was taking to try to save the economy during these supply shock periods. Okay, now the reason I bring this up is because this was COVID. We could say, okay, this was like a one-off kind of situation, once in a century or whatever. Pandemic, it's over, things go back to normal, and we move on. But then when we start to see things like this, floods, drought, hurricanes, wildfires, and the list goes on and on and on, the effect potentially is very much the same as what happened with COVID. Supply side shocks, these climate change effects ripping into various aspects in our infrastructure and our ability to grow food, our ability to distribute things, potentially has the same effect as a supply side shock. That is, the supply chain of the economy gets disrupted, and then things start to really start to unravel from that point. I want to go from there to talk about this from a historical perspective, and this is how I start that book, The Approaching Great Transformation. Every historical transformation began with turbulence and economic collapse. As a general rule, when the economic foundation of a society is significantly disrupted, it destabilizes everything else. Everything begins to change. The Roman Empire finally crumbled when its Mediterranean system of conquest, slavery, and trade was thrown into chaos by invasions from North Africa, and the feudal system of the Middle Ages was brought down when its agrarian economy was ruined by plague epidemics and wars over religion. Today, another historic sea change is looming, and the underlying cause, again, would be a major economic disruption. Though this time it won't be because of invading, conquering armies, at least I hope not, or plague epidemics. The disruption will be a global decline in the availability of oil or the punishing effects of climate change. Our current global system of production and commerce is driven by an imperative for endless growth and expansion. When politicians and economists talk about the economy, they generally applaud any signs of growth as, you know, the economic machine is doing exactly what it should be doing, right? But limited supplies of virtually all resources and supply chain disruptions bind this expansion like a rope tightening around every economy of the world. Yet, in a blind and desperate attempt to keep charging forward with more economic growth, governments plunge themselves into massive debt. Nonetheless, whether growth smashes into the wall of resource limitations and debt fatigue, or becomes ripped apart by hurricanes and floods, or simply shifts intentionally away from business as usual, our growth-driven economy is going to change. And as it does, our habitual ways of behaving economically and ecologically will undergo transformation, whether we choose it or not. We often say that our desire for high material standards of living is to provide for our families, our children. The cruel irony is that our children and grandchildren will be the first generations to experience the full brunt of the economic and ecological damage we're doing now. That is, unless we do something to change that. So here I want to quote a few passages from the very young Greta Thunberg. So Greta Thunberg, I think she's like 21 years old now and already world famous climate activist. And she compiled this book. It's an anthology. She did some writing in it, but it's also a collection of writings from a lot of other people. And in the book, she writes, quote, "The first step in solving a crisis is not evaluating the full situation or taking immediate action. That comes later. The first step in solving a crisis is to realize that you're in one. Our main priority must be to wake people up, not to send them back to sleep with soothing stories of progress from a deeply flawed system. We need new laws, new structures, new frameworks. We must no longer define progress only by economic growth, by GDP, or the amount of profit given to shareholders. We need to move beyond compulsive consumerism and redefine growth. We need a new way of thinking." That's the very young Greta Thunberg. What she's saying is that we need system change if we want to make it to the other side of the 21st century intact, if that's even possible at this point. Okay, so in that spirit, I want to create a storyline on global warming and climate change in order to see this problem more clearly. What is remarkable, actually, to me, is how much our scientists have known about global warming and climate change for a very, very long time. So we first learned about global warming in the 1850s from a also very young American scientist who conducted a series of basic experiments on the effects of exposure to sunlight and heat on various gases, including carbon dioxide. That scientist was Eunice Foote, and she was, pardon me?
No, I'm enjoying the dog.
Oh yeah, the dog, yeah. She was a scientist, but she was also an advocate for women's rights and suffrage. Anyway, she was the first scientist to conclude that rising carbon dioxide levels could change atmospheric temperatures to such a degree that our climate could be affected. Her work largely was not recognized because of her gender, but other scientists followed in her footsteps. Her experiments were published in the American Journal of Science and Art, and scientists in North America and Europe then, they read the work, they did their own experiments, they confirmed her findings, and it was established science. There was another key player This image actually is from a documentary about her. It's a short one. I haven't been able to find it, but I know it's out there somewhere. There's another scientist, a Swedish chemist and future Nobel laureate, Svante Arrhenius, in 1896. So keep that in mind, 1896. Confirmed Foote's work and projected that combustion from coal and petroleum could raise global temperatures to such an extent as to be noticeable in a few centuries. Sooner if combustion continued, and sooner yet if combustion increased. From these early developments on, scientific understanding of global warming steadily multiplied and reconfirmed the work of these early pioneers. In 1957, Roger Revelle, an oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego, commented that, quote, "Human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past, nor be reproduced in the future." Scientists became increasingly compelled to measure atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide so they could put eyes on it and track it. To that end, Revelle helped the U.S. Weather Bureau establish an observatory at the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, presumably 3,500 meters above sea level in the Pacific is a really good way to track and measure carbon dioxide. So they set up this observatory so they could track it, measure it, chart it, and a young geophysicist working for Scripps named Charles David Keeling began charting the CO2 data measured in parts per million on a timeline, and Scripps has been tracking it ever since. So maybe some of you are familiar with this. This is the famous Keeling curve, and at the time when it was created in 1958, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was 350 parts per million. And as you can see, from 1958 onward, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has been steadily marching upward. The sawtooth texture there is just seasonal fluctuations, normal seasonal changes in carbon dioxide. Roger Revelle continued his work and chaired the Science Advisory Committee to President Lyndon Johnson in the early 1960s. And in 1965, his committee submitted a detailed report with clear warnings about the dangers of carbon dioxide elevation. The report was titled "Restoring the Quality of Our Environment." And in the report, they said the following: "We are returning to the air a significant part of carbon that was slowly extracted by plants, buried in the sediment during the 500 million years, and the consequences could be deleterious from the point of view of human life on the planet." I want to repeat that phrase: deleterious from the point of view of human life on the planet. Climate science continued to progress in great strides, particularly with the aid of new computer models that could provide information on global warming's impact on climate as it affected seawater temperatures, among other things. At NASA's Goddard Institute, Jules Charney, the father of modern meteorology, had assembled a group of oceanographers, atmospheric scientists, climate modelers, and others contributing to climate science to see whether or not the planet was indeed headed for some kind of climate horror. In 1979, they published a report called Carbon Dioxide and Climate: A Scientific Assessment. The Charney Report, named after Jules Charney, the chair of that advisory committee, said the following. This is 1979 when this came out, so some of the language is dated here. Bear with me on that. "Each of our sun's planet has its own climate, determined in large measure by the planet's separation from its mother star and the nature of the atmospheric blanket. Life on life on our own Earth is possible only because of its equable climate, and the distribution of climatic regimes over the globe has profoundly shaped the evolution of man and society. For more than a century, we've been aware that changes in the composition of the atmosphere could affect its ability to trap the sun's energy for our benefit. We now have incontrovertible evidence that the atmosphere is indeed changing and that we ourselves are contributing to that change. Again, this is 1979. Atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide are steadily increasing, and these changes are linked with man's use of fossil fuels and the exploitation of land. Our carbon dioxide plays a significant role in the heat budget of the atmosphere, and it's reasonable to suppose that continued increases would affect climate. From the publication of this report, the Charney Report, it was established within highest levels of federal government, the scientific community, the oil and gas industry, and within the commonwealth of people who began to concern themselves with the future of habitability of the planet, the Charney Report would become the authority as the established fact, settled fact. It was the summation of all the predictions that had come before and would withstand the scrutiny of decades that followed it. Charney's group crunched some numbers on everything known about the sun, the ocean, the sea, the air, fossil fuels, and they finally arrived at the conclusion that if or when carbon dioxide doubled from pre-industrial times, the global ambient temperature would raise to about 3 degrees above what it was in pre-industrial times. Now, if you go back and you do some research on what 3 degrees above pre-industrial times would look like from the point of view of habitability on the planet, it would be a colossal disaster. Nathaniel Rich, the author of Losing Earth, writes, quote, "The last time the world was 3 degrees warmer was during the Pliocene, 3 million years ago, when beech trees grew in Antarctica. The seas were 80 feet higher, and horses galloped across the Canadian coast of the Arctic Ocean." The Charney Report created something of a political storm. Oil companies hired their own climate scientists and started looking for ways they could get out from under the issue. And they wanted to get out in front of it, but they also were concerned about losing their companies, obviously. But they were additionally concerned about potential damages down the road, like they were going to be sued for climate change. But at the time, Congress also was beginning to look at the government's responsibility to draft policy. They held hearings. They listened to scientists give testimony. They began their own investigations. And in April of 1980, Senator Paul Tsongas, Massachusetts Democrat, held the first congressional hearings on carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere. What followed was the Energy Security Act of 1980, which was passed and directed the National Academy of Sciences to start a multi-year comprehensive study to be called Changing Climate. It was beginning at this time, 1980, so we're looking at 40 some years ago. It was beginning to look as if the federal government was poised to begin seriously addressing climate change problems and take the lead in an international effort to reduce carbon emissions. But that hope collapsed in 1981 when Ronald Reagan became president. With regulatory reactionaries like James Watt heading the Department of Interior and Ann Gorsuch at the Environmental Protection Agency, they pulled the plug on nearly all federal government efforts at environmental regulation. The mood of the administration at the time was that they were setting out to unravel existing regulations, much less adding new ones. Nonetheless, the Charney Report continued to resonate, and its conclusions were confirmed by major studies from the Aspen Institute, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. These studies were followed by a surge of articles, and that would include a front page article in the New York Times. Study finds warming trend that could raise sea levels. Again, this is 1981. It was around this time that Jim Hansen, another scientist at the Goddard Institute, became the leading voice on climate change science, and also the many, many, many warnings that followed. But again, the Republican administrations of Reagan and then George Bush Sr. made it clear that they had no interest in listening to the scientists, nor any interest in taking meaningful action on climate change. That position was made unequivocal in 1989. In November of 1989, 400 delegates from around the world convened in a Dutch resort town of Noordwijk, I think I pronounced that, Noordwijk, to craft an international agreement to freeze carbon emissions and stop the upward climb of the Keeling curve beyond what was then, in 1989, 350 parts per million. Now, that number 350, maybe some of you have seen it. Bill McKibben's got that 350.org organization. 350 parts per million is that ceiling that Jim Hansen and other scientists say is the ceiling below which our climate is a safe habitat. If we go above concentrations of 350, then our climate starts to become a dangerous place. So this meeting at Noordwijk, like I said, it was 400 delegates that came together. The idea was to, craft a plan for globally to hold the carbon emissions down to 350, try to keep that Keeling curve from rising, but the meeting failed. And the meeting failed mainly because the United States delegates, under the leadership of John Sununu, refused to accept it as a binding agreement. Sununu was George Bush Sr.'s chief of staff and was openly hostile toward climate science and the scientists themselves. He dismissed the work of the Goddard Institute backhandedly as, quote, technical poppycock. His justification for killing the Noordwijk Initiative was based on, in my opinion, a sublime exercise in cynicism and self-justification. Because this is what he said. It couldn't have happened, this Noordwijk program. It couldn't have happened because, frankly, the leaders in the world at that time were at a stage where they were all looking how to seem like they were supporting the policy without having to make hard commitments that would cost their nations serious resources. Frankly, that's about where we are now, or where we are today. No single country can take on climate change. It has to be a global effort, but at the same time, there's a general recognition that no global agreement will be effective without the sincere involvement of the United States. So when this kind of cynicism became the raison d'etre of political inaction, it became a paradigm for others to follow. From that point on, over 30 years, international accords became formed without substance, symbolic gestures, and politics. It would be unfair to put all the blame on Sununu for killing government initiatives on climate change. He was part of the Reagan and Bush administrations in the 1980s that put in motion an agenda of neoliberalism. It is what I refer to in another book, the Greenspan Era. The Greenspan Era between 1987 and 2008, that's Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Federal Reserve. That was his tenure at the Federal Reserve, and he was instrumental in pushing forward this neoliberal anti-government paradigm, or I should say anti-regulatory paradigm. So neoliberalism is basically a renewed version of classical free market capitalism or free market liberalism, but instead of pushing government to the margins, they became key players in bringing everything under the sun into the sphere of corporate capitalism. Environmental or ecological economics was rebranded with this neoliberal agenda. With all the best of intentions, many ecologically minded economists were suggesting that the crises stemming from limits to growth could be circumvented by making capitalism greener. The core aspiration here is to do good and to do well. That is, to make ecological sustainability compatible with conventional economics and business models. Throughout the Greenspan era, the green economics brand was presented under various labels such as the New Green Revolution, the Green New Deal, the Green Collar Economy, Green Capitalism, and Natural Capitalism. Whatever it was called, the allure stems from the promise that going green can actually be profitable. This is a classic and irresistible win-win proposition that's music to the ears for Wall Street in our consumer society. But the pressure to make money and show returns push green capitalism into conventional corporate capitalism with the now all too familiar greenwashing. Sustainability became more of a marketing ploy, and as Heather Rogers called it, green gone wrong. And there others were writing about this too, about the greenwashing phenomenon. This idea that they're going to continue business as usual, but kind of make it dress it up a little bit. Writer Paul Hawken put it this way, with this cake and eat it to allure green economics. He said, quote, this is the dumbing down of criteria and the blurring distinctions between what is or what is not a socially responsible company. The problem with this, as I see it, is what I call maladaptive economics. That is, maladaptive economics is economic institutions and ideology that cannot adapt to a changing environment. Or as the cliche, what is it? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Doing economics in the same way over and over again, thinking that it's going to have different results, is another form of madness. This is my favorite economist, Thorstein Veblen. Under the selective process through which species are held to have emerged and gained their stability, there's no chance for the survival of the species gifted with such an aversion to the furtherance of its own life process. So here's why I say that green economics and corporate capitalism are not compatible. The logic is fairly straightforward, I think. So you start with the corporate bottom line, and all the corporate CEOs, they all have that same kind of responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, to generate returns to their capital investments. Those returns have to compound. That's exponential financial growth. But in order to have this kind of exponential financial growth, there has to be new market expansion, new products. Everything has to sort of, spread out. And that means more consumer spending. So combined, more market expansion, more consumer spending, what you end up with is endless economic growth. If we don't do this in our system, what happens? Everything starts to grind down, right? Everything starts to turn into a recession. Our leaders freak out. They start, trying to do whatever they can to prop this back up again. Endless economic growth is theoretically the diametric opposite of sustainability. Okay, in the fall of 2018, just as Hurricane Michael was trampling the southeast part of the United States, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a new report titled Special Report on Global Warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius, Summary for Policymakers. It was also at the time, right then, around when that report came out, that the parts per million and the Keeling curve pushed over 400. Now, there's been other IPCC reports that have come out since 2018, but this one in particular had the feeling of a final warning. It urged that immediate and comprehensive action needs to be taken to reduce concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in order to limit the most severe warming trends, to bring it down to 1.5 degrees or less over the next decade. Again, this is 2018. The IPCC notes that this effort would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban and rural infrastructure, including transport and buildings, and industrial systems. So basically what they're saying is something very similar to what Greta Thunberg was saying, is that we need to have a system change, including changes in attitudes. Last year, there was an interesting article appeared in The Atlantic titled, "There's No Scenario in 2050 is Normal," by Robinson Meyer. And in this article, he notes that the effort to get back to 350 parts per million, remember, we're up to 420 now, so getting all the way back down to 350 would require massive global decarbonization and removing the vast majority of vehicles from the road. Neither of those stand much of a chance. So the conclusion is that 2 degrees or higher is probably what we're going to be seeing coming down the road. Myers writes, quote, "Passing the 1.5 degrees Celsius means that the world could encounter deadly droughts, mass migrations, and fatal outdoor temperatures by the mid-century, by 2050. And he concludes with this: "Coping with climate change will require disruption on a scale that our political system has yet to comprehend. In some cases, the change will come beforehand, prevent the damage. In others, it will be the result of climate damage, but it will come nonetheless. If I ask you, 40 years from now, will only 5% of Americans own cars? Or will the world spend a large share of its energy production sucking carbon out of the atmosphere?" You would rightly respond that neither sounds particularly realistic. And that's the point. We've been backed into a corner. The scale of change headed our way is unimaginable, and it's also inevitable. The period when these unimaginable and inevitable changes come fully upon us is what I'm now calling late Anthropocene. The Anthropocene epoch is a proposed geological age that is mostly characterized by the impact human population is having on the planetary ecosphere. Moving into late Anthropocene is an ongoing process, but our understanding of these changes to come, as well as the changes themselves, are processes in motion. It's vitally important, therefore, that we, all of us, get ourselves prepared for more climate change-related trouble, rapid decarbonization, supply chain disruptions, and proactive work on system change for a post-carbon economy. So what I have here for the post-carbon economy is not a blueprint so much, is just like 5 areas where I think this work needs to be done. And one of them is to create a shadow structure. Conservation biologist David Ehrenfeld is quoted in the Transition Handbook, published in 2008, emphasizing, quote, "Our first task is to create a shadow economic, social, and even technological structure that will be ready to take over as the existing system fails." Or perhaps another way to say this is that as the current system declines, sprouts of new life will be ready to grow, as they are already emerging everywhere. shortening the supply chain. So I'm currently working on a new book called the New Triage Economy, and one major part of this is about shortening the supply chain. So among the most effective first steps crafting a workable and responsible economy for late Anthropocene will be to shorten the supply chain, during which the decades of lost opportunities of the Greenspan Era, the economic supply chain became long and complex structure of joint ventures and transactions and subsidiaries stretching all around the world. In the late Anthropocene and with the onset of COVID, that chain became fragmented in alarming ways. Weak links began to appear everywhere along the chain with more scarcities and shockingly high prices. Shortening the supply chain can reduce the need for transport fuel and energy and make electric vehicles and mass transit more viable. This would have to be predicated on harnessing as much renewable energy as possible and a build out of renewable energy infrastructure, charging stations, and et cetera at the local level. Establishing a local economic power base will be key in this. Relocalize the economy. So, shortening the supply chain, pulling economic activity tighter into our communities also means relocalization. And to relocalize the economy is to make them more self-reliant, flexible, creative, democratically accountable, and empowers people with more choices in the face of crisis situations. Whatever is coming down the pipe as far as climate change, we can be more effective in dealing with it at the local level than at the national level. This last year or so, looking at what's happening politically at the national level, I think the word dysfunction is appropriate. One such relocalization process or project is the Transition Network movement. The movement began in the UK around 2005 with the aim of fostering economic resilience and self-reliance at the local town level. It has since evolved into a global network of organizations and individuals who are creating and telling their stories of new economies. Many of the transition projects, including one right here in Rochester, include creating ways to increase the availability of land for local food production, helping local small businesses build and create distinct business models, helping to foster advanced skill sets among the local labor force, and aggregating finance for development projects. The person that was in here earlier was talking about a green energy credit union as it's a nationwide bank, essentially, that provides financial services for these kinds of things. The transition movement is centered on a set of principles that are in place to guide the work of reconstructing local economic institutions, to respect resource limits and create resilience, to foster inclusivity and social justice, to allow for self-organization and decision-making at appropriate levels, to pay attention to balance socially and ecologically, to stay committed to experimental learning networks, to freely share ideas, resources, and power, to collaborate with other networks, to look for synergies, to ensure that processes, events, and activities are helping people make connections and foster positive visioning and creativity. And this transition movement is global. I mean, there's transition projects all over the country, all over the world. The Great Reskilling is that as we pull our economic activity closer, tighter into our communities, when we start to build out that renewable energy infrastructure, we electrify things. We also, to become more self-reliant, we have to learn how to make stuff. all the stuff that we've been outsourcing around the world is stuff that we, are going to have to sort of relearn how to do. So the decarbonization process will eventually dissolve the current structure, global structure, based on a global division of labor. And this implies that ordinary people will have fewer options but to learn how to produce, repair, and maintain things themselves. To this end, transition communities have been holding workshops, courses, seminars, and teach-ins on a range of related topics. Though incomplete and evolving, this is a list of the skills that are suggested by the transition people. And it's quite comprehensive. And so Rochester's own Ivan Idso is one of the people who's got a program out there that's actually doing this kind of thing, community education, reskilling the local Rochester labor force on a whole range of things. And if you look through this, a lot of this stuff looks like it might be, a lot of fun to learn how to do. Okay, the more these skills are mastered by people in the community, the more diverse and resilient the economic activity of the community will become. Now, another aspect of this is institution building. The gigantic corporate and financial institutions that dominate our system are not programmed to work in a relocalized post-carbon system. Building new local institutions and restructuring existing ones means recreating social and economic structures that script social behavior with rules, norms, and shared strategies. If we seek to truly adapt to the profound changes that will accompany late Anthropocene, we will have no choice but to create new structures that will script social behavior with new rules, norms, and codes. Citizens can develop new and very different economic institutions that are not centered on endless economic growth and expansion, but on self-reliance, ecological permanence, stability, and a celebration of human creativity. In time, these institutional developments will help guide us to the positive evolution of economic systems and human culture. But this will require a transformation of mindset and expectations. Of course, there's a political dimension to this. The early 20th century American philosopher John Dewey argued that participatory democracy is more than just an exercise in political governance. He saw that an individual's personal development is intimately connected to the creation of a democratic society. For Dewey, people are naturally endowed with an instinct to actively shape the world around them. As we follow this instinct and become engaged in the democratic process, we can create better institutions that advance our social intelligence and foster the development of education, art, health, technology, and purposeful economic activity. By doing so, we create the opportunities for individuals to develop their own unique powers and capabilities. These powers and capabilities, in turn, will allow a person to become an effective participant in the life of a community and can advance the project of building new and better institutions. In this way, communities and the individuals who live in them can co-evolve. In this process, we can break the chains that have kept us dependent on this collapsing system and become more self-reliant. This empowerment that comes from being a willful agent of change is the essence of true participatory democracy. In her book, All Politics is Local, Megan Winter makes a strong case for why progressives need to be more involved in local politics. And this has been actually in the news and the media quite a bit over the last several months, that getting involved in local politics is something that the political right wing has been doing for quite some time now. So it's time for the progressives to get involved in that. So when we talk about building new economic institutions, what we're really, in the economic sense, what we're talking about is building new corporate institutions, new financial institutions, new labor institutions, all of the things that actually govern the economic process in Rochester or Portland or whatever community we happen to live in. And this is something that we don't have to reinvent the wheel to do this, because there are different projects that are taking place in different places around the country and around the world that, if we take one and another from one place and another place and we look at it to see if it fits in our community, it would be like putting pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. And that the image of that jigsaw puzzle, we don't really know what it is yet, because we're trying to describe and build something that doesn't exist. But we have to have faith that we're going to get there and become resilient and be able to do the things we need to do in our community as all these climate change things start to come at us. One particular area of institution building that is of interest to me, and I've written a couple of books on this, is the financial side. And the reason I say this is because if we can gain local democratic control of the circulation of money in our community, then we control the economy. It's like we control the heart and the blood of the economy. And there are a lot of different ways that we can do this. And which direction is west from here? So you guys are all pointing in different directions. It's over there. Your neighbor to the west, North Dakota, has a state bank, and it's a financial institution that functions as a public utility. So basically, what it does is it collects tax revenues, goes into the Treasury, and then the Treasury funds go into this bank, and then the bank recycles that money into the local community through local community banks and credit unions. So most of the states don't do it this way. When your taxpayer dollars, state taxpayers' dollars goes to the Treasury, those Treasury funds go into Wells Fargo or Chase, and then it goes out into the world, used for God knows what. So that's one way to democratize. At least we start to see where our taxpayers' dollars are going and how they can be recycled into the community, and then recycled back in through local clean energy credit unions. In my book, I wrote about this permaculture credit union in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It doesn't exist anymore because it merged with another bank in California. But the idea here is that these are financial institutions that provide financial services, the whole spectrum of financial services, for projects that are related to self-reliance, decarbonization, efficiency, energy efficiency, and so on. Institution rebuilding, creating new financial institutions, new economic institutions may seem like a tall order, but as Paul Loeb reminds us in his book, the impossible might take a little while.